home is a lot of work. Just plain work.
When work at home is planned and organized for cooperation, there can usually be more time for leisure.
I'm certainly in favor of those things. Leisure, fun.
Who isn't?
Wouldn't we all be happier if we worked out a little system for living together in harmony?
But how can we manage them?
We'll have to work out the full answer together.
Say, Mom, you're swell.
Most family problems can be solved through frank and friendly discussion, which points the way to a happy family life.
You know, this is beginning to be quite a family project.
It certainly is.
Well, before I explain what all that was about, I would just like to welcome those of you that are tuning in online or here in the room with us for the very first time. Maybe you were connected to Camp 75 in some way this past week. I just tend to think it takes a lot of courage to really go anywhere new, but especially trying out a new church. And so I'm so grateful that you're here with us. My name is Jordan. I get to be one of the pastors here at Northpoint, which means that I also want to extend an enormous thank you to the hundreds of you that collectively served nearly 5,000 people in our community over the course of Camp 75 in just this past week alone. That shatters records for us. You guys made a huge thumbprint in our community. And we just have a dream here of being so integrated into our community that if we were ever gone, our community would miss us, regardless if they believe what we believe or believe what we believe about Jesus or the Bible or any of those things, that we would just add such value to, that our city would know that we are for them. And you made a huge step towards that becoming a reality this past week. In particular, I'm grateful to be in this room with you because the last time I was here was Thursday night. There were about 450 students just wall to wall in here. Some of them I don't think have showered in their life. And so it smelled like a science experiment in here. I appreciate just very simply your hygiene. This is good to be together. So we are, like Matt said, we're starting a brand new series, which means that you haven't missed anything. I think it's helpful to know that we think more in terms of series than we do individual Sundays. It's like each part is just a part of a long movie. And so today's gonna feel incomplete. It is just the beginning of a conversation laying down some foundational ideas. But we are, as you could probably guess from the title, we're gonna talk about the myriad of dynamics that makes family both complicated and relevant in our lives. In our country and our culture, you can tell we are kind of obsessed with the idea of family, or at least other people's families. We spend hundreds of hours every year just kind of like creeping on other people, whether it's because it's aspirational or we just want to know we're not as weird as some other people and some normalcy, like whatever that might be. My wife, Emily, and I feel like we've transcended this a little bit. We don't really watch a lot of those shows. We go on walks and we look in people's homes. And or what you do, we probably have some kind of strategy to gauge, are we weird, are we not, what is normal? Maybe you have an ideal of what you want your family to look like, what you're dreaming of, what could be, what you want your parenting or marriage or whatever it might be, a future family someday. Maybe it resembles something like the feeling that you get when you look at The Incredibles. I put them up last service, and there was an applause for that, which you never know how people are going to react, but I guess it was popular with somebody. Sure, thank you, guys. Our students will clap for anything, which I really do appreciate. So these, whether it's like some kind of the feeling that you get, it's togetherness, or everybody's got their own story, or got each other's backs, or whatever that might be. Maybe it's something more like, just a cookie cutter, like Hallmark family. I don't even know if people have the Hallmark channel anymore, how this works, but, it's like, man, there's this picture, perfect, everybody is polite, always uses their manners. Maybe you see that, it just makes you want to throw up. You're like, my big dream is that my toddler doesn't escape the house without clothes on. I don't have high standards. It's just we're trying to survive right now. Maybe for you, when you think about an ideal family, maybe you picture something more like the feeling here where it's the idea of found family. Like you chose your family. You've gotten away from your family of origin and you've decided who gets to kind of play that role in your life. One of the things that I know that we have in common before I get into a lot of the diversity and what kind of makes this series complicated with all of our different experiences is that we do all have a family of origin. Now, for some of us, we don't really have great memories of that family. For some of us, we have no memory of our biological family. Some of us have had an incredible experience or are still living in it. There's an incredibly broad range, but all of us have relationships that have shaped us over the course of our life. And the other thing that's true for each of us is we didn't choose them. Maybe if you would go back, you would again, and that's an incredible gift if you would say that. For some of us, that is like our why God question. Like that is our hang up, our difficulty in even getting to call God a good father comes from the family of origin that we didn't choose. I would imagine for almost all of us, you at least had a point in like middle school or something like that where you would have chosen a different family. I know for me and my friends, we always had like this one house we always wanted to go to because their parents had no rules and we all wanted to be a part of their family. You get older and you realize that might have been a little dysfunctional actually, but for us, that was like what we looked forward to. So whether you have a positive, a difficult, most of us have a broad range and combination of all those things. The reality is our family of origin is played into the way that we build relationships today, healthy connections today, our level of anxiety, peace, confidence, identity, security, based on the safety of our home or the volatility of our home, based on the gender roles that we saw displayed, based on the traditions or the faith tradition that we grew up in, based on what we saw displayed to us, perhaps what happened to us or what did not happen to us. It impacts every single one of us, whether we are aware of it or not, willing to admit it or not, whether we've done some of the hard work or not. And not only do we all have a family of origin, but we're all dreaming of what could be for a current or perhaps future family as well. I think part of the reason that a series like this is so important is because I would say for almost every single one of us, 99%, for most humans, the most important role you will play in life will be connected to the idea of family. You can ask anybody in an end-of-life stage who is reflecting on their life, their great accomplishments and their regrets, and what you will not hear or find is people talking about the most important thing was the amount of money left in my bank account or my career path or how many countries I traveled to. You'll hear something about the role of a son or a daughter, a brother or sister, a husband or a wife, a father or a mother. The people that we will want to remember us fondly at our funeral are not strangers on social media. They're people that we once shared life with, perhaps lived in the same home with. We talk about this all the time, that you can't be replaced in your specific roles in your family. You can be replaced at work. You can be replaced in your hobbies. You cannot be replaced in the roles that you play in family, which means we have to talk about this. Is there a purpose to it? Is there a potentially an ideal, a North Star? What is possible, even in the difficult situations? What could happen? How could it challenge us? How could it grow us? I would say that part of the result of the important place of family in our life is it also means that family holds higher potential for both peace and pain. Family can be the vehicle or the unit for some of our most meaningful moments of life. Some of the moments that we breathe of most deeply, that we look back on and remember and miss most fondly, and can absolutely and often is the source of most pain because we open our hearts, because we have expectations, we have hopes and dreams, we're connected to, we're always with. And as a result, some of our deepest hurts, deepest pains, most significant anger, longest lasting tension in our lives can be from family as well, which makes this a very hard conversation to have in this format. And there's part of me looking at the series was like, man, maybe we just cancel the series because the 1 on 400 format just doesn't really work. We should just have 400 coffees instead, right? Because there are so many dynamics. This series is going to hit you a little different if you are single versus dating versus engaged, if you're married, if you're in between marriages on a second, third, or fourth, if you have kids or do not have kids or have been trying to have kids, if you have adopted or you have fostered, if you have siblings. There are so many dynamics that change the way that we're going to receive and a lot of things that we're going to hear throughout this series. And then you take all that, and you're like, we're going to have this hard conversation, specifically in church, where historically, maybe it's becoming less so, but historically the perception has been churches for families that have it together. I don't even know exactly what together means, but there's just something about church where you're, driving in, yelling at everybody in the car, and then you get out of the car and everybody smiles at guest services, right? And you're like, what is that? In fact, just to normalize it, if you were screaming at somebody on the way, no, I'm not going to make you do that. But that's how it feels, right? There's a guilt if we come in or leave that way. Church historically has been difficult for single people to engage with, which is always wild to me because every single one of us were single at some point. Many of us still are. If you think about how difficult it has been for divorced people to come into a church setting, and you think about statistically speaking, 50% of us in the room are going to know what that's like, and everybody else is going to be 1 degree of separation away. And yet there's just this perception of here's what family is supposed to look like, and here's what I have to pretend to be. You could say maybe it's supposed to look something like this. Maybe you've heard of something called a genogram before. It's kind of like an advanced, robust family tree. It doesn't just show your family, but it also shows kind of the relational dynamics. There are all these different codes and colors, and I'm not going to go through it all. But for the sake of today, just think that green is good. And each of those green lines means a level of harmony between each different member of the family. Think about, for me, one time I was in a room and there was a grown woman who had drawn her genogram. She's mid-30s, and she goes through and she writes a green line in every single member of her immediate and her extended family, like harmonious, connected relationships for every single person of her family. There was a counselor in the room who leaned in like a neurosurgeon. I mean, just precision, her body language, her demeanor, it was incredible to watch. She kind of leans to the side, and she goes, I'm so grateful that was your experience. Tell me a little bit more about that. And the woman said, well, my family, we just don't do negative. Like, we just don't do negative hard. Like, we're just positive. We're just happy. That's just like what was enforced. And I just had a really happy childhood. And she goes, okay, that's really great. I wonder, did you ever growing up have an overwhelming day at school? Like, did you ever have a bad day? Were you ever upset or angry? And she said, well, yeah, doesn't everybody? She said, so tell me, who did you go to when you were sad? This woman gets silent, about 35 years old, just breaks down sobbing in her chair, like uncontrollably. She spent the evening about 2 hours on the phone screaming at her mother, which was not part of the counseling exercise. She went and did that on her own, but came to this realization, like, we have been pretending to be the ideal for so long, pretending to be this perfect family, that I have no authentic relationships, no safe relationships, even within my own family. I have felt this pressure personally, like coming into church before. I think about in my own family, the first couple of years that I was here, maybe the first year or two, end of high school, early college, I would come and my mom wouldn't come with me. Now, my mom is an amazing story. We were just so blessed to have her in so many ways. My brother and I actually got to baptize her right there on an Easter Sunday several years ago. She has served in just about every capacity we have here. She's led kids groups and students groups and adult groups. But for the first couple of years, she wouldn't come with me. And the reason wasn't because she didn't like the preaching or the music. We didn't have the group or the ministry she was looking for, or any of those things that people might be looking for. She didn't come because she would have to sit alone. And it would be a reminder to her that her story isn't what she felt like was the ideal story or the perfect story you're supposed to have coming into a place like this. So just to clarify, as the communicator starting this series, I just want to make sure that you know that I know that I'm not going to put any weird or false expectations on you. This would be my family genogram right here with a whole lot of red. And this is kind of just a simplified version of it, right? I mean, we have lots of loss on both sides, young loss. We've got divorce on both sides. There's addictions, there's alcoholism, there's physical abuse, there's some severe depression. I mean, that is all throughout my family in there. There are so many ways in which the ideal perfection is not possible. It's not like we could improve and get there. I mean, like, it's gone. There are people that aren't here anymore, relationships that are permanently broken, right? Like, that's the perspective I'm coming from as I communicate this. And see all the way back to our grandparents. You can see, a lot of, you see Emily's parents and mine on there. I put the green lines of me to Emily and then to my brother. You can ask them about that, or if I'm exaggerating that, I also put it to our 5-month-old Davis on there, which you can ask him too. He's just not really going to respond, but you can see if those are true, but trying to rebuild some things. But all through there, extended families, we got aunts, uncles, we got my gay uncles over there. You got this whole family dynamic, and we're just like coming in being like, man, how can we have this real conversation? What I would like to do in part one to get started today is I would like to look at Jesus's family tree. And the reason that I want to do that is I want to try to establish him as a unique option in our world and our culture with where we go with all of these complicated family dynamics. Because I think what we will find is uniquely in him, somebody who can step into the messes with us, who can step into the real,
who can empathize, who has compassion for, grace for, and he exemplified it again and again and again, and his family background is full of chaos. And you will find, in combination with that, hope for a way forward, an ideal, speaking to what someday could be. And I just think that's so important because in our culture, I don't really know where you find that. In a culture that's surrounded by cancel culture, where at some point, basically every member of your family is going to hurt you, what do you do with that? We're just left with no family left. Or maybe our culture will try to tell you you're perfect just as you are, when in reality you're like, no, I'm not. I'm hurting. I need something different. And Jesus speaks to a different and what could be. So I want to jump into the first verse of the New Testament, which is so interesting with our series because you've got like beginning of the Bible, Genesis, you've got in the beginning and this grand creation narrative. But the first sentence of the New Testament starts with a family tree. This is how it begins. It says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And if you are trying to ever read through the Bible or you do the Bible in the year, you probably ended up skipping about the next 16 verses because it just lists a whole bunch of names, a lot of them hard to pronounce. And if you don't know the background or story, you're like, why was all this included in there? But Matthew actually does something shocking, and it stands alone in history because what most historians would do, they're hired scribes, they would try to make the family look the best way possible. In a lot of ways, what we would do on social media today. Historians would leave out kings that had lost major wars or battles. Some sons you weren't proud of, just don't write their name in there like they didn't exist and part of the family. Just leave out whole generations. This would be normal. You painted the best picture. You rarely, if ever, in a patriarchal society included women as well. Matthew does so 4 times in the course of his genealogy. Matthew doesn't just write the real. He goes out of his way to highlight, like uses some unique language and gives extra context just to talk about some of the chaos that the Jewish Messiah was coming through. As he writes to a Jewish audience that had been waiting for thousands of years, there had been no communication from God for 400 years, and Matthew is announcing the Messiah through his family tree. And he starts with Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Now, his audience would have had great respect for Abraham. This isn't so shocking off the bat. This is the one to whom God promised to bless the world through. And so you read that and you're like, that seems like a normal place to start. But even when you have a little bit of context of their story, there's a whole lot of family drama just in these first couple of lines. For example, Abraham's thing, like as great as he was, his big struggle that he repeatedly went back to again and again, is he would continuously lie and say that his wife was actually his sister. And he does it multiple times. Now, there's context and there's more to the story than that, but that's basically what it boils down to. Oddly enough, his son, Isaac, does the same thing. It's like a family thing. We tell people that our wives are actually our sisters. Like, could you imagine you get into a community group, you're just trying to be real with your story, and you're like, guys, I don't know what it is, but I did it again. I know she's my wife, but Tuesday I introduced her as my sister, and I can't stop calling. You're like, what is up with this family, right? It's a little odd. And you see this like generational pattern, this generational sin. You see this generational sibling rivalry here and as well. If you've ever thought like, man, I have a fear of becoming my mom or a fear of becoming my dad, you see some of these generational patterns of sin included right in the beginning. You see a reference there to Jacob, Isaac being the father of Jacob. Jacob's name means deceiver. Jacob lied and stole his older brother's birthright from his aging father, Isaac. That's Jacob's story. And then it includes the father of Judah, which of all the brothers we could have named was maybe the most embarrassing one to include in there. Not like Joseph, who had this great redemptive story. No, we're going to go with Judah. Well, what's up with Judah? We see in the next verse his connection to a woman named Tamar. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And Tamar, I actually have to give like a really high-level summary of, because she has a very R-rated story. Tamar, her story includes pretending to be a prostitute. Their relationship, Judah and Tamar, that's his daughter-in-law, and you can see right there that have a child together. So there is like really dark kind of family chaos that is happen on here in the first couple of sentences. Then we get to somebody who not pretended to be a prostitute, but who actually was, with Rahab. It says, Perez, the father of Hezron, Hezron, the father of Ram, Ram, the father of Amminadab. And a lot of here, we have some kind of normal people. We don't necessarily know the context of all their stories, but Aminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon, not Salmon, Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. And he includes someone who was a prostitute that was actually known for her lie. It's a very kind of gray moral story where she tells a lie that's kind of this greater good lie to protect some Israelites, but she's known for being a prostitute and for lying, and he goes out of his way and says, here's this non-Jewish woman who is a part of the Jewish Messiah's lineage. And then we move forward towards Ruth, which is the third woman mentioned, and it says Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, Ruth actually has more of a redemptive good story, a story of great faith, but she was a Moabite, which meant that there was tons of racial tension. And to include that in the Jewish Messiah's lineage would have been so easy to just kind of leave that one out, but he very intentionally includes her in there as he builds his way towards one of the kind of the climaxes of this lineage, which is King David. It says Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. And on the surface, David gets kind of remembered as this hero. He's like, man, wrote like a bunch of the Psalms. Remember David, like with David in the story of Goliath, we call him a man after God's own heart. And there were a lot of great, wonderful, faithful things that he did and contributions that he made. And he has arguably, or maybe the most tragic family story that we have recorded in the Old Testament. And Matthew wants you to know it. He goes out of his way to include this detail. Look what he says about King David. He says, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother, not was even Bathsheba. Could have used her name, could have left it out altogether. But he says, no, let me clarify who his mother was. Solomon's mother had been Uriah's wife. Not David, let me make sure it's clear, had been Uriah's wife. And he's talking about the story where David sleeps with his best friend's wife, gets his best friend killed in an attempt to cover it up. They lose that child together that they got pregnant together with, and then he becomes so estranged from his kids in the future that there's actually a civil war started between David and his son. It is an incredibly tragic story that really doesn't have a happy ending. And Matthew wants to make sure that you know that this is a part of Jesus' family tree. Last one I'll highlight for the sake of time is in verse 10. As it says, Hezekiah, who we actually talked about last week, the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh, the father of Amon. This would be like including, if you were to think, some of the worst tyrants in history, like some of the most evil, not just like people you have beef with in your neighborhood. I mean, like, this is somebody who is named the most evil king, full of sin. We're talking like building these statues to other gods. We're talking child sacrifice, just a myriad of incredibly dark things that he gets involved in. And he just says, hey, I want to let you know, the worst king of Judah, he is in Jesus' family tree. Not just like the family member you're a little embarrassed that shows up to Thanksgiving. I mean, like, this is the one that the whole world knows that person is not good. It's in Jesus' family tree. So you would think maybe things start to calm down when we get to Jesus, right? Like maybe there'll be a smooth transition into Jesus, and it almost kind of seems to start that way in 16. It says, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So now we'll like sanitize. Jesus will kind of change the trend, right? It'll be like a peaceful entrance into the world. Well, let's see what he says about Jesus in the first two sentences. This is how the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, but before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly because he's a great guy. So right off the bat, we have a woman who's pregnant out of wedlock, which in this culture is a huge deal. And then you have what is essentially the equivalent of divorce. They're technically engaged, but again, a different culture, it's more of a commitment. You have a divorce being the scene that's being planned as Jesus is entering into the world. Matthew is going out of his way to emphasize the humanity of Jesus. Yes, he is fully God in human form, but also fully man. And he comes from a very human line. And in his story is just about every single type of pattern, abuse, chaos, hurt that you could possibly include in your family tree. And he wants you to know that Jesus came from that line. And my theory is that he goes out of his way to include this because he walked with Jesus, because he followed him, sat under his teaching, broke bread with him. And Jesus was all about the real. all about meeting people right where they're at. Matthew himself was a tax collector who was shunned by his own people, seen as a traitor to his people, selling out for the Roman government. And one day Jesus walks up to him and says, "Follow me." And Matthew's like, "I'm not going to leave this stuff out of the family tree." And then you see Jesus live his life accordingly. You see him constantly leaning into the situations, speaking to the ideal and handling the real. You see him raising the ideal and having grace for the real. I think about the story of the woman caught in adultery. In almost no culture that I could think of or any religion would that be considered the ideal family dynamic. And yet Jesus comes to her defense and he says to the crowd, "Hey, you can follow the law and stone her if you want, but only if you're without sin. The old walk away first and then the young." And there's no one left but Jesus, who interestingly enough is the only sinless one, the one who could have taken action against her if he wanted to. But he looks at her, says, "They're all gone, so neither do I condemn you." And in the very next sentence also clarifies, "Go now and leave your life of sin." This is not what's best for you. This is harming you. I love you enough to say, go a different path. There is an ideal that I can help you get to. But he says both and holds both in the same moment. As he's defending her, speaks to the ideal. It's not like he was soft on marriage. He'd already raised the example, right? I mean, you see in Matthew 5:28, he said, "But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." He's raising perfection, raising the standard. It's not like he's soft on it. He just holds both in tension. Or I think about his interaction with the woman at the well, the famous moment where the woman becomes the first evangelist in human history, but she's a Samaritan woman. Hundreds of years of racial tension. These two never even should have interacted. And she says that. It says that the woman was surprised, for Jews refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. Just the fact that Jesus talks to her at this moment in the well is unbelievable, and they get into her story. They start talking about her past, and she says, "I don't have a husband." The woman replied, and Jesus said, "You're right. You don't have a husband, for you have had 5 husbands." Let's be clear. And you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. In no culture that I'm aware of, in no faith that I'm aware of, is working on your 6th marriage considered the ideal. And he calls it out. He leans into it. And then they start talking about how it is that she can connect with God. And they have this conversation, and she says one day the Messiah is going to explain it. I know that the Messiah called Christ is coming. When he comes, he'll explain everything to us about how to connect with God. And Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." He gives us her the incredible gift and honor of declaring who he is to her, revealing this news to her. And she becomes the first that gets to go share it. The first to go share the news of Jesus. A Samaritan woman to a Samaritan town, not even a Jewish town, for the faith that today has nearly 3 billion followers. And I love the way she shared the story. Look at the way that she decided to share the good news. It says that many Samaritans from the village believed in Jesus because the woman had said, "He told me everything I ever did." So we don't get to see, because we're reading it, the tone, the energy, the compassion, the pause, perhaps the emotion in Jesus' voice. But there was something about the way he met and communicated with her, that it was actually her ability to share her story and feel seen by Jesus that was what empowered her to put her trust in him and go share the good news about Jesus with her town. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if we were able to build a culture like that here? Actually, no, I didn't decide to skip the rest of the family series until we were on to the next one. I didn't have to go and kind of sanitize or hide or put on a fake nicety. No, it was actually because I found a place where I could be real that increased my confidence in who Jesus is, increased my love for, my faith in him, because he sees all of, knows all of my story, and there's nothing that I could hide from him. Jesus never shied back from the ideal, but always had grace for the real. He held both in tension. Another way that we'll say this in series, not just related to family, I mean, this is a bigger concept that applies to so many areas, that Jesus is the fullness of grace and truth. And in our brain, that's really hard because it almost seems like those two are against each other somehow, that we kind of can be 50% true and say some hard things, but not all the hard things. And then we can also be a little bit compassionate and understanding and patient. And that's Jesus saying, no, he was the fullness. He was 100% both, and he embodied it, and you saw that in the way he interacted with people. For us, we try to mix these two and match these two. For us, most often we do one of these two options. We either pretend to be the ideal, pretend with what we post online, pretend with kind of some of the, fake, positive, cliche settings or sayings, some of the things that we're willing to share in groups maybe. And what we realize is the longer you do that, that ultimately catches you. It results in a midlife crisis. It results in I just can't fake it anymore. I just can't pretend anymore. I can't just stuff down the anger or the hurt or the lack of forgiveness anymore. At some point, this ultimately catches up with us, and it's not helpful. The other thing that we try to do to make ourselves feel better about ourselves is we change the definition of the ideal. We say things like, this is fine, nobody's perfect, I'm just going to live my own story or my own truth, and you've got yours, as if there's nothing universal that applies. And we know when we do this to ourselves, we're just lying to ourselves as well. We're robbing ourselves of hope. We're robbing ourselves of a better future. We're robbing the next generation of an example to set to them. Neither of these are helpful in the long run. I think there has to be a third option that includes the ideal. And the ideal, which we're not defining fully today, but which we're going to talk about in various ways throughout the series, I think as we understand the ideal, it can provide so many things that we miss out on otherwise. It provides direction and hope. What is the North Star? What am I even aiming for in my singleness or this dating relationship or in my marriage or for my children? Is there something like bigger than just keeping them alive? Like, what's the purpose and goal of all of this? It provides us hope that if we are stuck, if we've been stuck for a long time, perhaps we don't have to stay that way. Maybe there is some relief or redemption or restoration. It provides healing and self-awareness even. Maybe we've been minimizing that thing that's happened to us for so long and said it's okay for so long that when we actually really understand the ideal and the gap between our real and ideal, we realize, oh, now I see why I've been so angry. I see why I've been in so much pain. That never should have happened. They never should have said that. They never should have left. They never should have reacted. And the more we can validate that gap between the real and the ideal, it's actually healing. It actually restores. It provides strength and encouragement to say, I'm not in this alone. In fact, I can't do this alone, and Jesus is in to walk along with me as well as trusted friends around me. And it provides experiences of God's love and grace. If we're going to operate from the assumption that God does love us, that he by definition is love, then if he has an ideal, and if you would be willing to be curious over the course of this series about what does he say is the ideal for all these different relationships, maybe it will help us to discover his heart for us, to know him better, to realize that he's trustworthy, that the only reason he throws an ideal out there is maybe because it's best for us. Not because he's trying to test us or punish us or any of those things, because he cares about your heart, and he handles it carefully. My ask over this entire series, and then hopefully beyond, is the bottom line of part one today. Would you be willing to hold the real and the ideal in tension? Based on our wiring, some of us want to fix it. We want to make it go away, which is why we pretend things are better than they are, why we feel like we need to change definitions. Would you be willing to sit in the discomfort of that? To say, this is where I am, this is the ideal, maybe this isn't even possible, maybe I disagree with Jesus' ideal, maybe I don't like what he said, maybe I have some pushback here, but would we be willing to sit in that tension and not try to make it go away? Because I actually think this is one of those scenarios where you need tension to function in a healthy way. There's so many examples in life, so many examples in nature, in the world around us, architecture. Think about it, just a bridge as an example. If the tension goes away, disaster ensues. Tension is the very thing that provides structure and safety and stability in so many areas of life. We can't just solve it. We can't just make it go away. So picture your symbolic bridge of whatever that tension is, and could it be that in that tension is exactly where Jesus can meet us? It's exactly where we discover his grace for us. Could it be in that tension, if we're willing to sit in it and make it not go away, where real healing can actually take place? Forgiveness, perhaps. Hope, or a way forward that we don't have to stay stuck. Could it be in the tension that we keep fighting for the ideals in our families and our legacies, what we want to be known for someday? Could it be where all of those things take place? And you actually can't solve it. We just have to keep admitting we are the real, we are not perfect. There is an ideal standard, and Jesus is the bridge, is the gap between the two. I want to communicate in part one today that we are here for you. If you just were with us the last 2 weeks, we did a series called In Our DNA, and we said for too long the church has been known for what it's against. We want to be known for what we're for. We're not going to try to beat you up in the series. We're not going to try to shame you in this series. We're not coming from an unrealistic place. We want to try to meet you right where you're at and create the safest place in the world to talk about anything, even when there is tension, even if you do perhaps disagree. We're going to try to inspire and talk about what could be. We're going to try to talk about hope and encouragement. We're going to talk about some really practical tools. Today is very much theoretical, but we're going to talk about simple things that you can try in your own family, and if you don't like it, fine, just discard it. But we're going to try to come alongside and create the safest place in the world to talk about anything, because we just believe that we have a Heavenly Father who is for you as well. So please, would you be willing to be curious and to hold the real and the ideal intention, and at least for the rest of the series, don't try to solve it, but just sit in it. Pay attention to what comes up. Pay attention to what we want to defend. Pay attention to what gives us hope or what causes overwhelm. And perhaps it's exactly in that tension where Jesus is desiring to meet us. Would you guys pray with me? Father, this conversation is so huge. To even call you that is hard for some of us because of our stories. To call you a good father. God, and you know that. You see all of us. You know our whole story. God, would you meet us in the pain and the anger and the hurt? God, would you encourage us if we're perhaps just tired and trying to keep going forward? Would you show us a new way? Would you show us perhaps new hope? God, would you show us how it is you view us and invite us into your heart? God, we need you to clarify all the whatabouts and what ifs and meet us where we are, and we just acknowledge and surrender. We're going to sit in the tension with you for the next several weeks. God, we love you. We need you, and it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.